Hi folks, hope you're enjoying and benefiting from our guitar lesson series. Remember, it's essential that you watch these lesson videos in order. Each lesson leads into the next, and you won't get the big picture if you skip any of the steps. Many of you have been searching for these answers for years. You might be tempted to jump ahead and look at lesson 24 because you're into the blues, but if you don't know your intervals and modes from lesson 12 and 17, you just ain't going to get it. Consider purchasing the 150-page official course handbook for $19.95 from our website at www.absolutelyunderstandguitar.com. You'll find that link multiple places here on our YouTube channel. Each of the 32 video lessons has a corresponding printable page that you can view to help with review and memorization. All of the charts and graphs I create in the videos are reprinted there. The package also includes our amazing chord, scale, and arpeggio encyclopedia containing most every useful finger pattern known to man. Reserve your copy today. If you like what you're learning here, tell all your friends and like and subscribe to our channel. So enjoy this lesson and continue on, and you will absolutely understand guitar.
Hi, welcome back to Absolutely Understand Guitar. I'm Scotty West. Today we learn more about other mode systems, including the modes of the pentatonic scale. You'll want to have your color-coded scale finger charts handy, as well as your slide rule. This is lesson 21, so make sure your booklet is open to page 21. Keep reviewing your past lessons. In the end, you have to have all this information down cold if you truly want to jam. All set? Here we go. Hi, welcome back. We got a lot more interesting stuff to talk about today. We're going to be talking about pentatonic scales, which a lot of you have heard a lot about over time, but I'm going to suggest that some of the information that you might have been told about pentatonic scales is not necessarily totally accurate. First thing we should just review just a little bit of for a second is this whole concept of modes right here. Remember, any given pattern of intervals can generate a system, can be considered a scale, and any scale can generate a system of modes. So we've spent a couple of hours talking about diatonic modes, and many people are familiar with that system of modes. If you take the pattern of intervals that is a major scale, and we wrote out 2 octaves here, if you look at that set of notes, but starting on different sets, you get completely different scales. And we've learned that the diatonic modes are Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian. And some of them are major scales and some of them are minor scales, depending on what's happening with the third. Remember, all major patterns, be they scales or chords, have note number 3 in them. Minor patterns, be they scales or chords, do not have note number 3 in them. They have the note that's 1/2 step lower than that, which is a flatted third. That is the difference between major and minor. Now, a lot of people are aware of these diatonic modes. I've had people that have gone actually to music school and understand about these modes, but they don't understand that these are not the only modes that there are. Any scale can generate a system of modes. It's just that sometimes that's not meaningful to talk about. In our last show, we learned that talking about the modes of the chromatic scale, for example, is not meaningful because all of the modes of the chromatic scale would simply be other chromatic scales. We would not discover any new patterns of intervals at all if we look at the modes of a chromatic scale. So what other scales have systems of modes that are worth talking about? And our first big batch, as we saw at the very end of the last show, are pentatonic scales. Now, remember that conversation when we first learned about modes, we found out that what was significant about them is that there was that one guy who was saying, wow, I can play one scale over several different chords. But then we found out that that wasn't accurate at all, that actually what he was doing was playing several different modes of that scale over different chords. And oftentimes, the first scale that people ever learn to improvise or jam with or create melodies with that way are not the diatonic scales. They're actually these pentatonic scales. Remember, pentatonic means 5 note. 5 notes per octave, 6 if you include the octave note, whereas diatonic scales have 7 notes per octave, 8 if you include the octave note. Now, we mentioned last week that the first mode of the pentatonic scale functions in most music sort of as if it were the major diatonic scale. It's just that there are 2 notes left out. Note number 4 and note number 7 have been skipped. Remember, a major pentatonic scale goes 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 8, and that gives you 2 step-and-a-half intervals, 2 augmented second intervals. Most of the other scales that we've looked at so far have all been patterns of whole steps and half steps. These are really the first scales that have step-and-a-half intervals in them, and there's 2 of them. In most common usages of the pentatonic scale, the major pentatonic scale is simply acting as a major diatonic scale with 2 less notes in it. You're skipping the 4 and the 7. We left ourselves with the question last week, why would you want to leave out the 4 and the 7? And the answer is the 4 and the 7 are difficult notes to control. They do not sound, shall we say, particularly the 4, they do not sound as stable and as successful as melody notes against a major chord. For example, here's a C major chord. Actually, I'll play it up an octave. Here's a C major chord here. Now, allegedly, all of the notes in a major scale are going to sound pretty good over that. But that's only if I don't stay on them too long. If I begin to dwell on them, I notice that certain notes sound better than others. The 1 sounds really good. The 3 sounds really good. The 5 sounds really good. But certain of the other notes, the notes that actually aren't in the chord, do not sound as good. For example, the 4. Listen to how downright ugly the 4 can sound. It's a perfectly usable note as long as I get on it and get off it. But I wouldn't want to dwell on that 4. So, one solution that some players employ is to simply skip the 4 altogether. This is how the pentatonic players play. A lot of you have been told that the main scale in modern popular music, in rock and roll music, is the pentatonic scale. But I'm not sure that that's all for the right reasons, really. A lot of times I think it's just because a lot of these players don't know their theory well enough, don't have their ears trained well enough to really understand how to integrate these more difficult notes. But we could certainly say that in the first mode, which, by the way, I call pentatonic Ionian, because after all, as we're suggesting it, it's going to function the same way as the Ionian mode would. I call that pentatonic Ionian. It functions pretty much the same as a major diatonic scale. It's just that the 4 and the 7 have been left out. Now, maybe there is some justification for leaving out the 4 and the 7 because they're difficult notes to control. At the very end of last week's show, though, we started talking about the 5th mode of the pentatonic scale, which I might call pentatonic Mixolydian. Remember, this is the Mixolydian mode is the 5th diatonic mode, so the 5th pentatonic mode might be known as pentatonic Mixolydian. It is the 5th mode of the major pentatonic scale. It is functioning as the Mixolydian mode, but again, you've left out 2 notes. What notes have you left out? You've left out the 3 and you've left out the flat 7. Why would you want to leave out these notes? These are some of the most useful and powerful notes that you have. The 3, you certainly can see why. The 5th mode, the 5th diatonic mode, the 5 chord is a major chord. Note number 3 would be one of the most useful and powerful notes that you have at your disposal at that time. Why would you want to leave it out? A lot of players who play this way are, like I think I said last week, they're shooting themselves in the foot by making it easier on themselves to play. They're missing a lot of opportunities to create more successful melodies. Remember, last week we mentioned that really, ultimately, if you ask me, in the end, you don't want to be a pentatonic player. You don't even really want to be a diatonic player. Eventually, you want to become a truly chromatic player who can control any one of the 12 notes over any chord in any key, anytime. That's a long row to hoe. You've got a lot more theory to get under your belt, and you've got hours and hours and hours of ear training to do before you'll really be able to control music on that level. But it is such a blast when you get there. If you think you're having fun improvising now, when you get to where you can truly control all 12 notes, it just opens up so much stuff. Let's take a look at the other pentatonic modes as well and find out that they are functioning as the diatonic modes also, but again, 2 notes are left out. For example, if we look at the second mode of the pentatonic scale, start on note number 2 of a pentatonic scale, and you get the second mode of the pentatonic scale, which I'm fond of calling pentatonic Dorian. So, in other words, in most chord progressions when you're playing this scale, it's going to be functioning as the Dorian mode, but you're going to be leaving 2 notes out. What notes are you leaving out? Well, this is one right here, which turns out to be the flat 3. Remember, Dorian mode is a minor scale. The other note you're leaving out is this, the other diatonic note you're leaving out is this one over here, which is the 6. Now, again, the 6 is a little bit, I want to say, of a difficult note to control. Certainly not as difficult to control as the 4. But look at the other note you're leaving out. You're playing over a minor chord, and you're leaving out the flatted 3rd. Why would you want to do that? That is one of your most powerful notes that you have at your disposal to listen to at any particular time. This is why I'm suggesting that, yes, you want to learn to play pentatonically, because dancing in and out of the pentatonic modes is a cool thing to add variety to your melody. And pentatonic scales have an interesting sound that you can exploit in compositions and in melodies. All I'm saying is you don't want to be stuck there like a lot of the kind of more amateurish players actually are. Let's look at the 3rd mode. Remember, the 3rd diatonic mode is Phrygian, so I call this 3rd mode pentatonic Phrygian. It's going to function in the song pretty much like the Phrygian mode with 2 notes left out of it. Now, in this case, as we follow this column of missing notes down here, we're going to be leaving out the flatted 2nd, and we're going to be leaving out the 5th. Now again, the flat 2 is going to be a quite difficult note to control. You have to be very careful with that one. So the pentatonic players maybe have some justification in trying to avoid that note. But the other note they're leaving out is the 5. That is the 2nd most powerful note that you have at your disposal at any particular moment. Why would you want to leave that out? The answer is there ain't no good reason if you ask me. Now, on to the 4th pentatonic mode. The 4th diatonic mode is the Lydian mode. So this 4th pentatonic mode I call pentatonic Lydian. It's going to function over the 4 chord in the piece. And this is one of the most fascinating things of all. One of the notes that we left out in our original pentatonic scale was the 4th, right? So many people would suggest that a pentatonic scale actually does not have a 4th mode, or it certainly doesn't have a mode that's rooted on the 4th note. But in my experience, you're going to find this very difficult to believe. In my experience, actually, the pentatonic scale does have a 4th mode, because, for example, you know your most common chord progression is a 1-4-5 progression, right? If you're playing pentatonically over that 1-4-5 progression, what mode are you playing over the 4 chord? Well, you're playing the 4th pentatonic mode. People go, but wait a minute, the pentatonic scale doesn't have a 4th mode because it doesn't have note number 4 in it. I go, yeah, but the funny thing is, oftentimes we use that scale as if it has a 4th mode, but one of the notes that's left out of it, believe it or not, is note number 1. These people who play pentatonically like that, one of the notes they're skipping in the 4th mode is the actual root note of the scale. That is absolutely your most powerful note. Why would you want to leave that note out? It's really bizarre. So I'm going to suggest that even though a pentatonic scale does not have note number 4 in it, this 4th mode of it operates as if there was a 4th mode. It's just that the notes that you're leaving out are the 1, the root note of the scale, and you're also leaving out the sharp 4. Over here, which is, of course, the note that actually, in a sense, defines the Lydian mode, although it is a little bit more difficult note to control, and when you listen to that sharp 4, your ear is going to have a little bit of trouble getting used to thinking about that note there. But how do you like that? Pentatonic players are often skipping notes that are important notes to use. And how often are you going to be playing the fourth mode of the pentatonic scale? If you're jamming pentatonically, how often are you going to use that mode? You're going to use it all the time, anytime you're playing over a 1-4-5 progression, which is, as we suggested, is the most common chord progression of all times. So some people think that the fourth mode of the pentatonic scale doesn't exist at all, but I'm telling you it actually does. It's just that one of the notes you're leaving out is the root note. How bizarre can that be? Anyway, we talked last week about mode number 5. That certainly is going to be another common mode that you're going to be playing. Over a 1-4-5 progression, you certainly are going to be playing the 5th mode of the pentatonic scale. And the notes you're skipping are the 3 and the flat 7, as we mentioned before, which are very, very common and useful and important notes. So I'm not exactly sure why anybody wants to do that. Now, on to the 6th mode. Remember, a pentatonic scale has, even though it's only got 5 notes per octave, I'm suggesting it has 7 modes, just like a diatonic scale has. The 6th mode of the major pentatonic scale goes 1, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 7, 8. It is operating most of the time in normal chord progressions as the 6th diatonic mode, which of course is Aeolian. So I call this scale pentatonic Aeolian. It's going to function pretty much like the Aeolian mode, except that you're leaving out 2 notes. And what notes are you leaving out? You're leaving out the 2. And you're leaving out the flat 6. These are, some of your less useful notes, so I don't know. There's some justification in leaving these notes out, but I don't know. Like I say, I think understanding the pentatonic theory is important, but in terms of constructing melodies, I think you miss a lot of opportunities if you play pentatonically. Now, there's another interesting thing about this that we're going to talk about for a moment. Take a look at this, the 6th mode of the major pentatonic scale. It goes 1, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 7, 8. Does that ring any familiar bells with you? Have you heard of that string of notes before? 1, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 7, 8. Well, hopefully you have, but if you have your must-know list of scales memorized at this point, you would recognize that string of notes. 1, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 7, 8 is a minor pentatonic scale. Remember, on our must-know list of scales, we have 2 pentatonic scales listed, major pentatonic and minor pentatonic. And what a lot of people don't understand is major and minor pentatonic scales are modes of each other. They have a modal relationship to each other. So, the 6th mode of the major pentatonic scale is the minor pentatonic scale. Now, actually, maybe this shouldn't be any terrible surprise to us at all. The 6th mode of the major pentatonic scale is the minor pentatonic scale. That's that good old 6-1 relationship. Do you remember what that was all about? How many times have we talked about that? The relationship between the tonal center, the 1 tonal center rooted on the 1 and the tonal center rooted on the 6th. That's that all very famous relationship, which actually we're going to be talking about a lot in our next lesson when we talk about minor key music. But there is a very strong relationship between the 1 and the 6. It's known as that relative major, relative minor relationship. In diatonic harmony, it is the relationship between the Ionian mode and the Aeolian mode. Remember, the Aeolian has another name too. It's often known, you may know it more familiarly as the what's called the natural minor scale. The natural minor scale is the same as the Aeolian mode. And there is a very strong relationship between Ionian and Aeolian. I always kind of use the yin-yang symbol. I go, it's the light side of the force and the dark side of the force. The relative happy major happy tonal center, and then the 6th is the relative minor, which is like the dark side of the force, if you will. And that same relationship exists in a scaled down form, if you will, between the 1st and 6th mode of the pentatonic scale. It's a mini version of that relative major, relative minor relationship. The 6th mode of the major pentatonic scale is the minor pentatonic scale. 1, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 7, 8. we are going to be talking a lot about minor pentatonic scales in a couple of hours from now. I can't remember whether I talked much about this in the last show, but there is a huge subject that we're going to be going on to in popular music after our next hour's show, which a lot of you I know are chomping at the bit to want to learn about, and it's the whole concept of playing blues type music. Very popular for years now, for several decades in popular music. Blues harmony, it has been very, very popular. And when I say blues, I'm not even talking about old blues like B.B. King and stuff like that. I'm talking about the majority of hard rock music, to one degree or another, involves what I might call, oversimplifying it a little bit, what I might call this blues style of thinking. And many of you may know that the minor pentatonic scale is a very important scale in blues type playing. When you have been doing your improvisations and creating your melodies so far in this program, you might have been kind of going to yourself, this stuff sounds a little too pretty the way I'm creating my melodies right now. The way Scotty's got me jamming now, I don't hear that really bad kind of quality that you get, that badass kind of quality that you get from that blues hard rock type of sound. That's because a lot of that involves very specific usages of the minor pentatonic scale in this style of music that we call blues, and that's what gives blues that really edgy kind of sound. Just hang in there for a couple more hours and we'll be talking all about that too. For a lot of you, that is mostly what you listen to, and this diatonic harmony and this pentatonic harmony that we're talking about here may almost sound a little too pretty for you. Ultimately, I would like to see all of my students kind of expand their taste out to where they're listening to major key music and they're listening to minor key music and they're listening to blues music. A lot of us get stuck in these little narrow, harmonic type focus, you know what I mean, which is particularly a lot of young people get stuck in one place or another like that, and a lot of it has to do with exposure. So much of the music that we are exposed to now on the radio has this bluesy hard edge that a lot of people almost get addicted to it, and they don't seem to be able to listen to anything else. I'm here to tell you that's simply a matter of conditioning. I think I've mentioned this before, but we all like the type of music that we allow ourselves to be exposed to. If you try to broaden, if you purposely try to broaden your horizons and listen to styles of music that are perhaps initially less palatable to you, you will learn to appreciate them. I always say a style of music that I've been working on for years, believe it or not, is opera. I've always liked classical music, but when I was younger, it was like every time the opera would come on, I'd turn the channel. And one day I just this is years ago now, one day I said, I'm not going to do this anymore. There's too many people out there that like opera. There must be something going on in there. And I just started not changing the channel when the opera came on. And I would fall just short of calling myself a fanatic opera fan at this point. But I sure enjoy listening to it and appreciate what these people are doing a lot more than I ever used to. A lot of you love to hate certain styles of music. One that we all get these days is everybody loves to hate country music, you know what I mean? And yeah, there's some pretty sappy things about country music, I think sometimes, but boy, listen to some of those pickers play that guitar. We talk about fast playing when we talk about heavy metal and stuff like that. Some of those country pickers, boy, they can play twice as fast as the heavy metal guys, and many of them play strings of notes that are really much more interesting, I think, than the heavy metal guys do. And you're going to have trouble believing this, but it's really all a matter of exposure. And it's up to you what you want to listen to. But in the end, the broader styles of music that you can listen to, the more it comes into your own playing, and the more you can use the stuff you learn from other styles of music in your playing, no matter what style of music that you're playing yourself. So there's my tirade for the day. It's like it's kind of like try. Another interesting thing is I think it has a lot to do with age. A lot of young people, they use music for one purpose. They kind of use music to hype themselves up. So they're into all this really aggressive kind of music. Well, as you get a little older, you might find that there are some other usages for music for yourself. Like, for example, you you might want ultimately to find some music that helps calm you down after a tough day at the office and the screaming kids and all. You might really appreciate some mellower music that helps you relax some more too. So the more you can expose yourself to in terms of styles of music that you listen to, the better off you're going to be ultimately as a real, true musician. So, anyway, back to what we were talking about before. This is this very important relative major, relative minor relationship between the 1 mode of the pentatonic scale and the 6 mode of the pentatonic scale. What that means, interestingly enough, I'll show you. Remember, in your color-coded finger charts, you have fingerings for major and minor pentatonic scales. Let's look at these 2 charts here. Oh, let me switch them around too, because here's, we'll put major on this side, minor on the other side. Remember when we first started talking about modes in general, we learned that since all of these different diatonic modes had all the same notes in them, that the same finger pattern would work to play any of those scales. You can use the same finger pattern to play any of the modes: Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian. The same thing is going on with pentatonic scales. You can use the same fingerings to play both major pentatonic scales and minor pentatonic scales. Look at pentatonic number 1 up here as an example, and then look at minor pentatonic number 1 up over in this corner over here. If you look at pentatonic 1 and minor pentatonic 1, once again you will see that the dots are in exactly the same place. Now, I'm not talking about the coloring of the dots again, because remember, that's the point here. It's all about the function of the individual notes in these patterns. But one thing you can tell is from the pentatonic number 1 to the minor pentatonic number 1, the dots are all in exactly the same place. Yes, the coloring has changed, but that's my exact point. Even though these are exactly the same notes, they are going to be functioning as different numbers relative to where you consider the root note to be. Let's zero in here on pentatonic number 1 for a moment if we can. And if you look here, you can see that there's your root note right there. Now, because remember, red, in our color coding system, red is always your root note. These other 2 red dots are simply octave notes of that one, aren't they? That's 1 octave above that, and that's 2 octaves above that. Therefore, it's 1 octave above that right there. Now, also, by the way, as you know about your finger shifts, that note and that note are the same note, aren't they? So that's why you've got 2 dots over here. It's 2 different ways that you could play that note right there, either as a pinky shift on your B string or as a index finger shift on your high E. Now, take a look at where the red dot is here again on pentatonic number 1. Now, if we follow the notes in this is a pentatonic scale, we see that it goes 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. So this note right here, this indigo colored dot, the darker blue dot right there, is the 6th note of the major pentatonic scale, isn't it? It's note number 6. Now, if we can look over here at the minor pentatonic scale, we are going to see that the indigo dot from the major pentatonic scale is actually now the red dot in the minor pentatonic scale. What that means is the 6th note of the major pentatonic scale is now functioning as the root note of the minor, of its relative minor pentatonic scale right there. So the same fingering can be used to play either a major pentatonic scale or a minor pentatonic scale. Now, we just used that one as an example. All 12 of these pentatonic finger patterns here can be used to play either a major pentatonic scale or a minor pentatonic scale, or indeed it can be used to play any one of the other modes of the pentatonic scale. Pentatonic Dorian, pentatonic Mixolydian. I didn't, in my finger charts here, go into quite such detail with the pentatonic modes as I did with the diatonic modes. You have a separate finger chart for each one of the diatonic modes, don't you? Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian. Well, I only made finger charts up for the major and minor pentatonic scales. I didn't make a separate chart, for example, for pentatonic Locrian or stuff like that. you certainly over time will be able to figure that stuff out for yourself, and I just leave that up to you. Remember, another thing that I mentioned is that you might like to do for yourself is take these finger charts to your local print shop or copy center and get a few sets of these made up. You're gonna want to cut these all up into flashcards. Last couple of times we've talked about the diatonic modes, and we chopped these pages up into finger charts. You might want to wind up doing that same thing with your minor pentatonic scales, and there's all different ways that you can combine these on your music stand and notice different relationships between them and stuff that way as you go. So very significant fact. Major and minor pentatonic scales are modes of each other, and it's that old 1/6 modal relationship between the two. Okay, we still have one more pentatonic mode. It is the 7th mode of the pentatonic scale. Now again, many people don't understand that there actually is a 7th mode to the pentatonic scale because, for example, one of the notes that we skip in the pentatonic scale is note number 7. So that would lead some people to believe that a pentatonic scale does not have a mode number 7. But actually, in my way of looking at it, it actually does. It's just that one of the notes that you've skipped, again, is the root note. One of the notes you're leaving out is actually note number 1. We saw that we did that same thing with the 4th mode up there, didn't we? Now, the 7th mode, in general, whether it's diatonic or pentatonic, is nowhere near as commonly used as say, most of the other ones are. Remember, that's the one that's neither major or minor. Since the 7th diatonic mode is Locrian mode, you might recall that if you look back particularly, that scale has a flatted 5th in it. Remember, both major and minor scales have to have note number 5 in them. Remember, the difference between major and minor is what's going on with the 3rd. Major has a 3, minor has a flat 3. You will notice that the Locrian mode has a flat 3 in it. So it might lead you to believe that it's a minor scale, but the Locrian diatonic mode also has a flat 5 in it, which means it's neither major or minor. Patterns that have a flat 3 and a flat 5 in them are what are called diminished patterns. You could make a note of that for yourself right now. We are going to be talking about diminished phenomenon later on in the program. You might also be familiar with the term augmented. We are going to be talking about augmented and diminished more from the point of view of what happens in chords, and then we'll look back at what that implies about what we need to know about scales too. But for the most part, just remember now that the 7th pentatonic mode is functioning like the 7th diatonic mode, which is Locrian, but 2 notes are left out. What note is being left out? Well, the 1. Now, why would you want to do that? I don't know. You're leaving out one of your most powerful notes. The other note that's being left out, interestingly enough, is that flatted 5th, which is one of the defining notes of the Locrian mode as a diminished pattern right there. It's kind of a moot point because most rock and pentatonic players don't use the 7th mode very much at all anyway. How many times have you actually seen diminished chords in rock and roll music? The percentage is very low. Some people use them more than others, some of our more sophisticated songwriters, but if you're talking about basic old rock music, as you probably noticed, most of your chords are either 5 chords, power chords, or they're major chords or they're minor chords. You've got your dominant 7s and stuff like that, but just not very many diminished chords at all. So this 7th mode is what we call pentatonic Locrian. Not a terribly common mode, but it does exist, and a lot of people don't even know that. So, there you go. That's the subject of pentatonic modes. Just the last thing we will remind ourselves of is that pentatonic modes function pretty much like, F-U-N-C-T-I-O-N, function like diatonic modes, but there are just 2 notes left out. Why would you want to leave those notes out? If you ask me, there just isn't a lot of good reasons. But anyway, that's that. We are going to talk a lot more, as I mentioned before, about these pentatonic modes when we look at blues music. Oh, I remember something I was going to mention before that I forgot about. A lot of people that think they're playing pentatonically are actually playing minor pentatonically. I just had a student who had that problem the other day. He came in and he was jamming over his jam tape pentatonically, and he's going, "See, I'm playing I'm playing pentatonically," and it turns out that he actually wasn't. He was actually playing out in a minor pentatonic sense. The sound that he was producing had that bluesier, rockier kind of edge to it. He was actually using the sixth mode. He was actually using the minor pentatonic scale instead of the major pentatonic scale. Let's just listen to that for a second. Let's go up to the keyboards. Let me show you that. Actually, I'm going to try to transpose this thing too. Let me go up 12. And now, again, a key of C. Listen to this C major chord right here. Now, here's a major pentatonic scale. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 8. That's a really rather pleasant sounding scale, isn't it? It doesn't have any of that bad quality that blues type playing does. It's actually a very peaceful and pretty scale. He thought he was playing a pentatonic scale, but actually he was playing a scale that had more of this bad sounding quality to it. Now listen to this. Now I'm going to play a minor pentatonic scale. Notice how this has got more of that bluesy kind of sound. Listen to that kind of ugly note, that flatted third there. 1, flat, 3, 4, 5, flat, 7, 8. Doesn't that add that more blues kind of sound to it and all? Now, of course, the reason that he was confused about that was that very fact that we were talking about a few minutes ago, that the same finger pattern can either work as a major pentatonic scale or it can work as a minor pentatonic scale, depending on which note you consider to be the root note in the pattern. And he was actually using it like a minor pentatonic scale, but he was thinking that he was playing a major pentatonic scale. Just another thing. So you might listen to that yourself. If you're jamming over your blues jam tape there, if everything sounds a little too pretty for the blues, you may be using it more like a major pentatonic than like a minor pentatonic scale. Whereas if it's got that bad kind of bluesy kind of sound, then you're using it as the minor pentatonic scale. Okay, remember, our subject for today is, after we look at the must-know list, are these the only scales that there are? No, there's a bunch of other scales. Any scale can generate a system of modes, and we have, in a sense, just discovered 5 new scales. We already knew about major pentatonic and minor pentatonic, but we didn't know about pentatonic Dorian, pentatonic Phrygian, pentatonic Lydian, pentatonic Locrian down there. So we've uncovered right there some new scales that were not on our original list of scales. We are still searching for what other scales might be out there that are worth knowing about too. And remember, we said when you look at the modes of certain scales, sometimes it's meaningful to look at them and other times it isn't. When we looked originally back here at our must-know list of scales, we suggested that we already know about the diatonic modes. These are the ones that are delineated with our Roman numerals over here. We know that they're all part of that system of diatonic modes. Now, we're looking down here. We might fill this in on our chart here. Pentatonic and minor pentatonic scales down here, we just found out are actually modes of each other. They have that famous 1, 6 relationship. Here we got this big swooping arrow over here, don't we, between the relative major and the relative minor, between the 1 and the 6 here. You might want to pull out on that shot just a little more, or at least it looks like that on my monitor. You see this line here between the 1 and the 6. That same relationship exists between the 1 and the 6 pentatonically too, your major pentatonic and your minor pentatonic. So pentatonic scales have modes. The modes of the chromatic scale are not worth talking about because they'd all be the same. The modes of the whole tone scale are not worth talking about because they would all be the same. A diminished scale would have 2 modes. You could either start off with a half with a whole step, or you could have a second scale which would start off with a half step. So a pentatonic or a diminished scale has two modes. The second of those scales has two names that I'm familiar with. Sometimes it's called half step diminished as opposed to whole step diminished. You might have heard of these scales and wondered what they were. Another set of names that I've heard for these scales is this one that starts off with a whole step is called diminished, and the one that starts off with a half step is called double diminished. That's the name I use for it, and you'll notice you actually have a finger chart for a diminished scale, and you also have a finger chart for double diminished. Notice that the first interval in your diminished scale finger chart is a whole step, but the first interval in your half diminished scale is a half step. Okay, now, so those aren't worth looking at systems of modes about. What other scales on this page have a system of modes that are worth talking about? Well, look at this. Melodic minor. Right here. Melodic minor, the way we're looking at it in the modern era, goes 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. In other words, it's essentially like a major diatonic do, re, mi scale, except that it has a flatted third in it, making it a minor scale. 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Would that scale have modes? Yes, it would. And how many modes would it have? Well, since a melodic minor scale has 7 notes in it, it would actually have 7 different modes as well. And they would all be different from one another. And we have just discovered 7 more scales, the modes of melodic minor. Let's talk about those. These scales are not anywhere near as common. In fact, some of these are profoundly uncommon. But there are a couple of these modes at least that you're going to bump into now and then, so you should know something about them. There is a system of modes working off of the melodic minor scale. So over here, we're looking at melodic minor modes. Now, we're not going to go into great depth on these because these scales do not, I want to say, show up. Well, let me ask you this question first. Would these scales ever show up in strict diatonic music, textbook diatonic music, where the chord scale relationships in the song are based on the major diatonic scale and its modes, and the embedded chords within those modes? Would the modes of melodic minor ever show up in strict diatonic music? And the answer is no, they wouldn't, because what scales would you be using there? You would be using your diatonic modes. These scales wouldn't necessarily show up that much. These scales show up in music that, for one reason or another, is slightly removed from major diatonic music. Remember, when we talked about diatonic harmony in a strict sense, we suggested that only 50% of the music that you're ever going to play works strictly with these diatonic modes. Only 50% of the music you've ever heard works that way. How does the rest of the stuff work? Well, as we've been mentioning today, another chunk of the puzzle is this blues stuff that we'll be talking about in a couple of hours. There certainly is music out there that's just so weird it can't be analyzed on any level. But there are some other things, particularly when we talk about the subject of modulation, where certain pieces of music actually change key right within the song itself. So you don't stay in one key, you move around to different keys. That's slightly more sophisticated types of chord progressions. That's when these scales are apt to show up, a couple of these in particular. So I want to at least alert you to these scales. You also have finger charts for all these scales in your booklet there, and you should know something about them. There are going to be times when you're playing songs and you're analyzing certain chord progressions where the scales, the normal diatonic scales, are not going to be working for you. You're going to hear yourself playing some kind of sour notes in there that don't work the way they're supposed to. You can then begin to suspect that it might be a case where you're using one of these scales here. It's a bit beyond the scope of this program to actually be able to tell you every last thing about how you're going to use these scales down here. But I think by the time you get to where you're using them, you'll have enough experience where you'll see what you're supposed to do anyway. I will try to give you one example of how these modes work. Now, the first mode of the melodic minor scale, of course, is melodic minor itself. So, mode number 1 of the melodic minor scale is melodic minor. Now, if you start on the second note of the melodic minor scale, then obviously you're playing the second melodic minor mode. Now, interestingly enough, look how this scale goes. 1, flat 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 8. Have we ever seen that scale before? No, we haven't. This is a completely new scale. These are the modes of melodic minor. They do not cross-reference with any of the diatonic modes or anything. We have never seen a scale that has this particular pattern of notes and intervals before. 1, flat 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 8. What do we call this scale? Well, the modes of melodic minor are named after the diatonic modes, because even though we haven't seen a scale that's exactly like this before, we have seen a scale that shares 6 of the 7 notes with this. There is for every melodic minor mode, there is a diatonic mode that shares 6 of the 7 notes in the scale, and they just are named after the diatonic modes. For example, this second mode of melodic minor is identical to the Dorian mode, except that Dorian mode has a natural 2 in it, and this scale has a flatted second in it. Dorian goes 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 8. But this scale goes 1, flat 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 8. So this scale is normally known, in my experience, as Dorian flat 9. Now, you might recall that 9 is in an extended musical number system, 9 is the same as 2. So a flat 9 is the same as a flat 2. I'm not exactly always sure why they don't call it Dorian flat 2, but they in my experience, it's always called Dorian flat 9. In other words, it's structured very much the same as the Dorian mode. It just also has a flatted second in it. Now, if we look at the next mode down here, the third mode of melodic minor goes 1, 2, 3, sharp 4, sharp 5, 6, 7, 8. Third melodic minor mode. It has a sharp 4 in it, which is going to make it in some way similar to the diatonic Lydian mode. The fourth mode of the major scale is the Lydian mode. It's a major scale that has a sharp 4 in it. So this scale shares 6 of the 7 notes with the Lydian mode. But Lydian mode has a regular 5 in it. It doesn't have a sharp 5 like this scale does. So this scale is named after the Lydian mode. This is the third mode of melodic minor. It is called Lydian, but sometimes you'll hear it called Lydian sharp 5, because that's what it is. It's like the Lydian mode, but it also has a sharp 5. Sharp 5, though, implies another concept, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, which we haven't talked a great deal about yet. Sharp 5 is all involved in the concept of what's known as augmented. So other times you will see this scale called Lydian augmented, because it's like the Lydian mode, but with the sharp 5, it is more likely that it's going to be played over an augmented chord in some kind of particular situation. The fourth mode of melodic minor goes 1, 2, 3, sharp 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 8. Now, again, this shares 6 of the 7 notes with one of your diatonic modes. This scale is like the... Whoops, I'm in the way here, aren't I? This scale is like... Once again, it's like Lydian because it has the sharp 4 in it. Might want to pan that way just a little so we can see up here a bit. This scale is very much like Lydian again, but see how it also has the flat 7 in it? 1, 2, 3, sharp 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 8. This is the fourth mode. It's also, in my experience, named after the Lydian mode. This is called Lydian. But the note that makes it different from Lydian is the flat 7. So this is called Lydian flat 7. Now, some of these scales are more common than others in my experience, at least in pop rock music. And it turns out that this one, the fourth mode, Lydian flat 7, is actually quite a common scale. You have a finger chart for it. You're going to want to learn to play it. If you graduate beyond practicing your diatonic scales and your pentatonic scales, and you're looking for something new to work on, starting to work on your melodic minor modes, this fourth mode, Lydian flat 7, is one of the most common ones that you're probably going to want to play. It's also a really wicked cool sounding scale too. I think I'll play this one on the guitar so folks can hear this one. Really neat sounding scale. One of my favorite scales of all times. A bunch of different tunes that I've written over the years wound up having this scale in it right here. It's a, it's going to sound primarily like Lydian mode. That's Lydian mode. 1, 2, 3, sharp, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Oops. That's Lydian mode. But not only is this like Lydian mode, but it also has a flat 7 in it. So it goes 1, 2, 3, sharp, 4, 5, 6, flat 7. 1, 2, 3, sharp, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 8. Oops, I played the 4 again. Isn't that a cool sounding scale? You find a lot of chord progressions that are just slightly outside of kind of what we might call the norm. Employ that scale right there. A student of mine brought in a scale book the other day that we were looking for, and I noticed that we were looking through, and I noticed that the scales that were listed in that book, they had all the diatonic modes, they had major pentatonic scales, minor pentatonic scales, they had whole tone scales, they had diminished scales. In other words, they had our entire must-know list. And they only had 2 other scales listed in that book that were outside of that. One of them was Lydian flat 7. That book, which was a kind of a simplified scale book, it felt that fourth mode of melodic minor was worth knowing. So is the next one. Really another very interesting scale is the fifth mode of melodic minor, which goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, 8. Now again, this is very similar to a particular diatonic scale. This is generally named after the Mixolydian mode, because this is, after all, a major scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But and it has a flat 7, like the fifth diatonic mode, which is Mixolydian. But Mixolydian has a regular 6. It doesn't have a flat 6 like this scale does. This scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, 8, is named after the Mixolydian. It's called Mixolydian. But the flat 6 is known as a flat 13. Remember, in your extended number system, 6 is the same as 13, so flat 6 is a flat 13. This scale is known as Mixolydian flat 13. Also, a very common one of these scales. It's just outside of the realm of the diatonic stuff. Let's listen to that one for a second. These are the 2 that are most common. Now there's your regular old major scale again. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. You've heard that a million times, haven't you? Now, Mixolydian is also a very common scale, as we know, which is like a major scale with a flatted 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7. There's that bluesy kind of flat 7 note. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 8. This scale not only has a flat 7, but it also has a flat 6, so it sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, 8. Oops. You know what I think is fascinating about this scale? It starts off sounding like a major scale. Re, mi, fa, so, do, re, mi, fa, so. Starts off like a major scale, ends like a minor scale. Part of that is there are no other major scales that we've ever played so far that have a flat 6 in them. all the major scales that we play have a regular 6 in them. A lot of the minor scales that we play have flat 6s in them. So when we hear that flat 6, it almost kind of like sets our ear up to think that we're hearing like some kind of minor scale. So this is a scale that kind of changes color right in the middle of the stream. It's like the lower part of it sounds like a major scale. The upper part sounds like a minor scale. This is also another very common scale. I mean, certainly not as common as the other ones on your must-know list here. But this fifth mode of the melodic minor scale is a fairly common scale called Mixolydian flat 13. The 6th mode of the melodic minor scale goes 1, 2, flat 3, 4, flat 5, flat 6, flat 7, 8. Now, this scale is named after, let me think now. My mind just went blank. The 7th, how do you like that? The 7th or the 6th mode. Oh, yeah. Locrian 9. Oh, okay, yeah. How could I have forgotten that? This scale shares 6 of the 7 notes with our diatonic Locrian mode, the 7th mode of the diatonic scale. Locrian, you might recall, is that one that's diminished. It has a flatted 3rd and a flatted 5th in it, Locrian has. Flat 3, flat 5. Also has a flat 6 and a flat 7. So this is very much like Locrian mode, except if you look at Locrian, you'll notice Locrian has a flat 2. Whereas this scale has a natural 2. So this scale is named after the Locrian mode. The 6th mode is called Locrian, but then it indicates that it has a 2 in it instead of a flatted 2. It's called Locrian natural 2, or natural 9. And not a terribly common one of these scales. You've got a finger chart, and if you're really a go-getter, if you want to find yourself in more advanced styles of music as you go, you might want to learn all of these different scales. Finally, our last melodic minor mode goes 1, flat 2, flat 3, flat 4. How do you like that? We've been led to believe that there would never be any such thing as a flat 4, would there? Actually, flat 4 would be the same as 3, wouldn't it? Flat 5, flat 6, flat 7, 8. Occasionally, you do see things like this happening. Again, it's to avoid redundancy within the naming of the notes. If I called that a 3, then I would have 2 notes in the scale that were named 3s. I would have not only a flat 3, but a 3. So this is often referred to as a flatted 4th in this case. Now, this, again, is not a terribly common scale in my experience, certainly not in pop music. And they don't even, in my experience, name this after any particular diatonic mode. It is simply called, the 7th mode of melodic minor is simply called an altered scale. And again, we're trying to make you aware of as many scales that you may bump into over the totality of your career. You might at some point want to look at your altered scale. If you do get into more advanced styles of music, jazz and the like, you may find yourself using this scale, but not necessarily. So there you go. We've been on a hunt today for more types of scales that aren't on the must-know list, and we're not going into them in terrible detail and when you're supposed to use them and all, because you won't find yourself using them that much. By the time you get to the point where you need that information, you will know enough about music theory so that you'll be able to buy books and they'll actually make sense to you. I know a lot of you bought music theory books and tried to read them and they just didn't make any sense. Hopefully this program will teach you enough about how music theory works so that you'll be able to go back to those books you bought and they will begin to make some kind of sense to you. And the further you get along in the process, the more these different types of scales will show up. Well, there you go. That's about it for today. These 2 scales of the modes of melodic minor, Lydian flat 7 and Mixolydian flat 13, are probably the ones that you might like to actually start working on. The other ones you can just add as you go. Next week, we're going to be talking again about an absolutely fascinating subject. There are not just 12 keys, as we have been painting the picture all along. There are 12 major keys. But next week, we're also going to talk about a whole huge subject in music. There is a lot of music out there that is said to be in minor keys. And what does that mean? And we'll be talking about that next time. But until then, I'm Scotty West. Have a great time. Keep on practicing. Keep on thinking about music. And you are so far along now. You know an awful lot about music. And over the next few years, it'll all come together for you. Okay, we'll have a good time, and we'll see you next week.